That creek, she said, pointing a pudgy, manicured finger that trembled with a strange mix of excitement and rage, is now officially designated as a community asset of the Creekwood Estates Homeowners Association. Your so-called property line is an outdated concept, Mr. Davison. We have a master plan. I stood there on my own land, the cool morning air smelling of damp earth and pine, and stared at the woman who had materialized at the edge of my property like a bad omen. She was exactly 50, maybe a few years older, with a helmet of blonde hair that looked like it could withstand a hurricane, and a plus-size frame squeezed into a pastel pink tracksuit that screamed suburban authority. This was Karen, the newly crowned president of the HOA that had sprung up around the 10 acres of heaven I'd bought 5 years ago. I'd watched the development go up, cookie-cutter houses marching up the hill, but I was insulated by my acreage, or so I thought. "You're talking about my spring-fed creek, Karen," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "The one that originates from the aquifer under this very land. The land I own." She produced a sheaf of papers from a large, ostentatious handbag, waving them like a weapon. "I'm talking about the Creekwood Estates Community Water Feature. We've already had the preliminary plans drawn up. We're diverting the flow to feed the new Olympic-sized swimming pool and lazy river complex by the clubhouse. Your little trickle," she said with a dismissive sneer, "is going to serve a greater purpose now. You'll be billed quarterly for your share of the maintenance, of course." The sheer audacity of it left me breathless for a second. It was like someone walking into your house and telling you they were requisitioning your living room for a community theater. She was declaring my private water source, the heart and soul of my land, to be public property, and she was going to send me the bill for its destruction. That was the moment the war began. It wasn't just about water. It was about a fundamental principle I'd spent 25 years in the Army Corps of Engineers defending. This was my land, my home, and no tin pot dictator in a pink tracksuit was going to take it from me. If you're watching this and you've ever had to deal with an HOA that's lost its mind, hit that subscribe button right now. I want to hear your own nightmare stories in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from, because I promise you, what happened next is a masterclass in how to dismantle a tyrant, one document at a time. Now let me take you back to how this all started, before the lawyers and the shouting matches, before the whole community became a battleground. I'm Jack Davison, retired lieutenant colonel. My wife, Sarah, and I bought this land as my retirement gift to us both. It was a perfect rectangle of rolling hills, old-growth oaks, and at its heart, a natural spring that bubbled up from the limestone bedrock and formed a crystal-clear creek that wound its way through the property. It was the reason we bought the place. The water was so pure you could drink it straight from the source. For years, it was our sanctuary. I built a small, sturdy footbridge over the creek, milled from a fallen oak on the property. We had picnics by its banks. Our grandkids chased frogs in the shallows. It was peace, earned and paid for. When the developer bought the adjacent farmland, we weren't worried. The zoning was for half-acre lots, and our 10 acres were clearly marked on every county plat as a single, indivisible parcel. The developer, a reasonable guy named Henderson, even came by to assure us our property boundary was sacrosanct. The first houses went up, and with them came the whispers of an HOA. We were given the option to join, a formality since our property predated the development charter. We politely declined. Why would we? We had no shared amenities, no common ground. We were an island of green in a sea of beige siding. The HOA, Creekwood Estates, was formed, and for the first year, it was quiet. They argued about lawn height and the approved shades of mailbox paint. It was background noise. Then Karen was elected president. She'd bought one of the largest houses right on the edge of the development, where her backyard overlooked my property. From her deck, she had a perfect, commanding view of my creek, and apparently that view sparked not admiration, but ambition. Her first act as president was to commission a community asset survey, and my creek was item number one. Her logic, as I'd later pieced together from furious neighborhood gossip, was that since the creek eventually flowed off my land and through a small culvert under the main road into the development's retention pond, it was a shared waterway. That was the flimsy legal thread she was using to justify her grand theft. That morning, As she stood there brandishing her ridiculous master plan, I felt a familiar switch flip in my mind. It was the same switch that flipped when a critical bridge project was behind schedule, or when intelligence showed an imminent threat. The emotion, the anger, it gets compartmentalized. The mission becomes everything. And my mission was clear: to protect my home and to systematically, legally, and utterly dismantle Karen's power. I looked past her, at the brand new houses gleaming in the sun, and I knew this wasn't just about her. She was a symptom of a sickness, an entitlement that believed a committee's vote could overwrite a man's deed. I just nodded slowly. "Karen," I said, the calm in my voice seeming to unnerve her more than shouting would have. "You and your association are about to make a very, very expensive mistake." The first official salvo arrived 3 days later, delivered by a certified mail carrier who looked deeply apologetic. It was a thick envelope embossed with the grandiose Creekwood Estates HOA logo, a stylized wave curling over a pine tree. Inside was not one, but three separate documents. The first was a formal notice of non-compliance, complete with blurry, zoomed-in photos of the footbridge I had built over my creek. According to Bylaw 17, Section C, subsection 4, any structural additions visible from community property required pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee, or ARC. My bridge, built with my own two hands from wood grown on my own land 5 years before the ARC even existed, was now an illegal structure. The fine was $200 plus a $50 per day penalty until the offending structure was removed. The second document was a cease and desist order drafted on what looked like a cheap online legal template. It commanded me to immediately halt all personal and recreational use of the Creekwood Estates community water feature, pending the finalization of the community development plan. They were ordering me to stop walking on my own land near my own creek. The third and most galling document was an invoice. It was a preliminary engineering and survey assessment fee for the grand total of $3,500. It was my share of the cost for the survey that had determined my creek was their asset. They were charging me for the reconnaissance phase of their invasion. I laid the papers out on our heavy oak dining table, the same table where Sarah and I had signed the mortgage for this land. Sarah read them over my shoulder, her hand resting on my arm. She was a nurse, a far more empathetic soul than I, but she had a core of steel. "They can't be serious, Jack," she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. "This is madness. This is our home." I tapped the invoice with my finger. "This isn't madness, Sarah. This is strategy. They're trying to bleed us. They think we're just some old couple who will get scared, write a check, and roll over." I could practically hear Karen's logic. Hit them hard and fast with a blizzard of paperwork and shocking fees. Overwhelm them. Make compliance the path of least resistance. It was a classic shock and awe tactic, adapted for the cul-de-sac. But she'd picked the wrong target. 25 years in the Corps of Engineers teaches you a few things. First, you never ever buckle under initial pressure. Second, you learn that bureaucracy, while often infuriating, has its own set of rules, and the person who knows the rules best wins. Karen thought she was wielding the rules. In reality, she was just reading the cover of the book. I went to my office, a room filled with topographical maps, engineering textbooks, and framed photos of projects I'd overseen around the world. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Operation Creek Freedom." It was a bit dramatic, but it centered me. It defined the mission. My response had to be as methodical as her attack was chaotic. I drafted a letter. It was polite, formal, and utterly uncompromising. I addressed each of their points separately. Regarding the bridge, I cited the date of its construction and the date of the HOA's formation, pointing out the legal impossibility of retroactive application of their bylaws to a pre-existing structure on a non-member property. I attached a copy of our property deed, with the boundary lines clearly marked. Regarding the cease and desist, I stated simply that my land was private property and their authority ended at my property line, as defined by the county plat. I informed them that any attempt to enforce their order would be met as an act of trespass. Regarding the invoice, I marked it "Return to Sender," No contract, no obligation. I added a sentence at the bottom. Any further invoices of this fraudulent nature will be forwarded to the State Attorney General's office for review. I sent my response via certified mail, return receipt requested. I knew it wouldn't stop her, but it was the first shot fired back. It was my declaration that I would not be intimidated and that I would be fighting this on the battlefield of paper, a field where I was very, very comfortable. A few days later, I saw her reading my letter by her mailbox. Even from 200 yards away, I could see her posture stiffen, her face flush a deeper shade of pink. She looked up, her eyes scanning my property until they found me standing on my porch. She held up the letter, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it into her recycling bin with a flourish of theatrical disgust. The message was clear. She was rejecting my diplomacy. The war was escalating, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that this was going to get much uglier before it was over. She had no idea who she was dealing with, the depths of my patience, or the meticulous, grinding power of a man with a righteous cause and a deep love for research. The crumpled letter was a declaration of total war, and I began to mobilize accordingly. Sarah, bless her heart, saw the look in my eye and knew what was coming. She'd seen it when I was preparing for deployments, a quiet, intense focus that consumed everything. "All right, Colonel," she said one evening, putting a cup of coffee on my desk. "What's the battle plan?" I gestured to the growing pile of files on my desk. Phase 1, Reconnaissance and Intelligence Gathering. Karen was using paperwork as a weapon, but she was an amateur. I was a professional. I was going to build a fortress of documentation so solid, so irrefutable, that her entire campaign would shatter against it. My first move was to set up a comprehensive surveillance system, not just for security, but for evidence. I installed several high-resolution, motion-activated cameras, the kind used on wildlife preserves. One was focused on the property line where Karen had first confronted me. Another had a clear view of the creek as it flowed toward the culvert. A third was aimed at my front gate and driveway. Every file was automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server, time-stamped and dated. Any in-person interaction, any unauthorized vehicle, any surveyor's stake hammered into my soil would be captured in crystal-clear 4K. Next, I went digital. I created a master spreadsheet, a work of organizational art. Every piece of correspondence from the HOA, every threatening letter, every bogus fine, every email was scanned and logged. I noted the date received, the sender, the alleged violation, and my official response. I created columns for certified mail tracking numbers, both sent and received. It was a chronological record of their harassment, growing more damning with each entry. But the real work was historical. Karen's entire argument, flimsy as it was, hinged on the idea that the creek was a community waterway. To defeat that, I had to prove its history as a private, integral part of my specific parcel of land. My evenings were no longer spent watching television or reading novels. They were spent hunched over the county's online records portal, a digital labyrinth of deeds, plats, and zoning ordinances going back decades. I started with my own deed, of course, tracing its lineage backward. I found the sale from the Henderson developer to me. Before that, the sale of the entire 200-acre tract of farmland to Henderson. Before that, the farm belonging to the Miller family for 70 years. I kept going back, sale by sale, inheritance by inheritance, through the 20th century and into the 19th. The language was archaic, the script sometimes hard to decipher, but the maps were clear. On every single plat, from a hand-drawn survey in 1888 to the digital GIS map of today, the spring was marked with a small starburst symbol, and the creek was a solid blue line drawn entirely within the boundaries of what was now my 10-acre plot. It was never depicted as a shared resource or a public utility. It was always part of the whole. Sarah became my research partner. She had a knack for spotting details I missed. One night, while I was getting lost in legal descriptions filled with rods and chains, she pointed to a digitized document from 1952. It was a permit application from Old Man Miller to the county. He wanted to build a new barn. On the application, in a section for water sources, he had written in clear, cursive script, private spring on property for agricultural and domestic use. Below that, a county inspector had signed off on it, his signature a bureaucratic stamp of approval on the private nature of my spring. "Print it, Jack," Sarah said, her voice electric with discovery. "Print it and log it." We were building our arsenal. I made a binder, then a second one. I organized them with colored tabs: HOA correspondence, property deeds, historical plats, county permits, photographic evidence. It was becoming my life's work. I also started a quiet counterintelligence operation. I'd take my morning walk, not just around my property, but along the public sidewalks of Creekwood Estates. I'd nod and smile at the neighbors. Most were hesitant, clearly having heard Karen's version of the story, but some would offer a tentative smile back. I was gathering atmospherics, gauging the sentiment of the community she claimed to represent. I learned to identify the members of her board: a timid-looking man who always seemed to be mowing his lawn, and a woman who walked her two yapping poodles with a fierce proprietary air. They were her lieutenants. This meticulous process wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about managing my own anger. Every time a new letter from Karen arrived, the fines for the bridge were now up to $1,000, and she'd added a new violation for unapproved landscaping near the creek. I wouldn't let the rage consume me. Instead, I would calmly open the envelope, scan the document, log it in my spreadsheet, file it in the binder, and draft another cold, professional response. Each piece of paper she sent me was another nail she was hammering into her own coffin. She thought she was burying me in bureaucracy, but she was just handing me the ammunition I needed, piece by piece. The weight of my binders was growing, and with it, my confidence. This was my turf now. The battle would be won or lost in the details, and Karen had no idea how deep I was willing to dig. Karen, realizing her paper-based shock and awe campaign was having no effect on my ironclad refusal to comply, decided to take the fight public. She was a politician at heart, and she knew that public opinion, even in a micro-society like an HOA, was a powerful weapon. She called a special community town hall meeting. The flyer slipped under the wipers of every car in the development and pointedly left taped to my front gate was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive propaganda. It promised an important update on the community enhancement project and a discussion on shared natural resources. The subtext was clear. It was a rally to turn my neighbors against me. Sarah and I debated whether I should even go. "It's a trap, Jack," she argued. "She'll control the microphone. She'll have her allies planted in the audience. You'll be walking into an ambush." "I know," I said, looking at the flyer, "but if I'm not there, she controls the entire narrative. They'll only hear her side. I have to be there. I won't speak unless I'm given a fair chance, but I will be present. Let them see I'm not afraid." The meeting was held in the newly finished and still unfurnished clubhouse. It was a large, soulless room with beige walls and a faint smell of new carpet and paint. In, a wave of whispers followed us. Heads in, a wave of whispers followed us. Heads turned. I saw people I'd nodded to on my walks now looking away, refusing to make eye contact. Karen had been busy. At the front of the room was a long table with Karen in the center, flanked by her two board members, the timid man and the poodle walker. A large projector screen was behind them. Karen, dressed in a power red blazer, tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "As you know, your board has been working tirelessly to enhance the value and beauty of our wonderful community." She launched into a slick presentation. The first slide was an artist's rendering of the proposed pool complex. It was absurdly lavish. A winding, lazy river, a zero-entry pool with fountains, a tiki bar, and lush landscaping. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. "And the best part," she announced dramatically, "is that we have a unique opportunity to make this project not only beautiful, but environmentally friendly and cost-effective." The next slide was an aerial photograph of the entire development. My 10-acre property was clearly visible, but it had been outlined in red. A bright blue arrow pointed from my creek, across my property line, and directly to the site of the new pool. Our community is blessed with a natural water source, the Creekwood Creek, she said, coining a new name for it on the spot. By tapping into this existing flow, we can save hundreds of thousands of dollars in water costs over the long term, keeping our HOA dues low and our property values high. She was brilliant in a devious way. She was framing the theft of my property as a financial windfall for everyone else. She was making them accomplices by appealing to their wallets. Then she turned to the problem. The next slide was a picture of my footbridge. Unfortunately, access to this shared resource is currently being obstructed. She let the word hang in the air. The individual who owns the adjacent, non-member property has so far refused to cooperate with our community's vision. She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. Every eye in the room flickered back to me. He has claimed this community asset as his own, she continued, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. He wants to hoard this beautiful resource for himself, denying it to your children, denying our community the progress we deserve. We have sent letters. We have sent official notices. We have tried to be reasonable. Are we going to do about it? He asked. Are we going to do about it? He asked. A perfect plan. Karen smiled, a predator's smile. We are exploring all our options, legal, financial, and procedural. But we need to show a united front. We need to send a clear message that Creekwood Estates stands together. In the back, a man I recognized from a few houses down cleared his throat. He was a tall guy in his late 40s named Dave, with a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. I'd seen him working in his garage, and he'd given me a friendly wave once or twice. Karen, he said, his voice calm but caring, I'm a little confused about the legal side of this. The creek originates on his land, right? How does that make it ours? A wave of discomfort went through the room. It was the first note of dissent. Karen's smile tightened. An excellent question, Dave. Our legal counsel has advised us that under riparian rights doctrine for community developments, any waterway that flows into common areas is subject to HOA governance for the betterment of the whole. It's a bit complex, but trust me, we are on very solid legal ground. It was complete and utter nonsense. A garbage legal theory she'd either invented or gotten from a cut-rate lawyer who told her what she wanted to hear. I felt my hand clench into a fist, but I stayed silent, just as I'd planned. I watched Dave as he sat down. He didn't look convinced. He looked troubled. He caught my eye for a brief second, and I gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture, but it was an acknowledgement. He'd asked the right question. He was thinking for himself. The rest of the meeting was a coronation for Karen. People clapped and cheered as she promised them their lazy river, funded by my water. When she asked for a voice vote to approve the board moving forward with all necessary actions to secure the water source, the ayes were a deafening roar. There were only a few scattered nays, Dave's among them, and my own silent refusal. We left as soon as the meeting adjourned, the feeling of 60 pairs of eyes on our backs. That was awful, Sarah said as we walked into the cool night air. I felt like we were on trial. We were, I said, but it wasn't a total loss. I was thinking of Dave. In a crowd of followers, one man had dared to question the narrative. It was a start. Karen had won the room, but she'd also revealed her strategy, and in doing so, had planted the first tiny seed of doubt in an intelligent mind. And in a war like this, a single seed of doubt could grow into a rebellion. The town hall meeting emboldened Karen to a dangerous degree. The roar of applause had been a potent drug, convincing her that she had an undeniable mandate from the people. Her next move was a direct physical escalation, a clear crossing of the line from paper harassment to outright trespass. I was in my workshop cleaning and oiling a set of old wood planing tools when the motion alert from camera 2 pinged on my phone. I pulled up the live feed. 2 men in bright orange vests were standing at the edge of my property, right next to the creek. They had a tripod, a theodolite, and a set of wooden stakes with pink plastic ribbons tied to them. Surveyors. My blood ran cold. One of them took a step across the almost invisible line between the HOA's manicured grass and my wilder meadow. He unslung a sledgehammer and picked up a stake. I was out of the workshop and moving across my lawn in seconds. I didn't run. I walked with purpose, my old combat boots eating up the distance. The sound of the first stake being hammered into my soil was a physical violation. Thump, thump, thump. It echoed in the quiet air. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice low and hard. They both jumped, not having heard my approach. One was a young kid, barely out of his teens, the other a grizzled man in his 50s with a sun-beaten face. "You're on private property," I stated. The older one, the crew chief, wiped sweat from his brow. "We're with Landmark Surveying, hired by the Creekwood HOA to stake out the diversion channel." He said it like it was the most normal thing in the world. He pointed to a spot about 20 feet inside my property line. "That's where the intake pipe is going to go." He was so casual, so sure of his authority to be there. This was how Karen operated. She deputized contractors, giving them a sense of legitimacy that made them her unwitting foot soldiers. They probably had no idea they were breaking the law. "You were hired to commit a trespass," I said, planting my feet. "The HOA has no authority on this side of those marker stones. I'm telling you both once, politely, pick up your equipment, remove that stake from my land, and leave immediately." The kid looked nervous, glancing back and forth between me and his boss. The older surveyor, however, puffed out his chest. He'd clearly dealt with angry landowners before. "Look, pal, we've got a work order. It says survey the creek. That's what we're doing. If you've got a problem, take it up with the HOA. We're just doing our job." He turned his back to me and gestured for the kid to continue. It was a critical moment. I could escalate physically, but that's what they'd expect. It would make me the crazy old man Karen was painting me as. I needed to use a different kind of force. I pulled out my phone. "Okay," I said calmly. "You're leaving me no choice." The surveyor chief laughed. "What are you going to do, take my picture?" "No," I said, dialing. "I'm calling the sheriff's department to report a trespass in progress." The man's confident smirk vanished. His face went pale under his tan. Dealing with an angry property owner was one thing. Dealing with law enforcement was another. His job didn't pay enough for that. "Now hold on a minute," he stammered. "There's no need for that. We've got a contract." "Your contract is with the HOA, not with me," I interrupted, keeping the phone to my ear. "And their contract doesn't give you the right to set foot on my land. I've already informed them of this in writing. You are now trespassing." The deputy I spoke with last week, Sergeant Miller, was very clear on this point. I was bluffing slightly. I hadn't spoken to a Sergeant Miller last week, but I had reviewed the county's trespass statutes, and I used the name from a local news article I'd read. It added a layer of official credibility. The surveyor held up his hands. All right. Sheesh. No need to get the cops involved." He turned to the kid. "Pack it up, Timmy. This one's not worth the headache." He yanked the stake out of the ground with a grunt, leaving a small, wounded hole in the earth. As they were packing their tripod, a county sheriff's cruiser pulled slowly down the road and stopped. My bluff had accidentally become reality. A deputy on a routine patrol must have seen the commotion. A deputy, a woman with a calm, professional air, got out of her car. On her name tag it said Allen. The surveyor chief's face went from pale to ghostly white. Deputy Allen walked over. "Everything all right here, folks?" I explained the situation calmly and factually. I was the property owner. These men, hired by the HOA, had crossed my property line and begun work without my permission. I had asked them to leave. The surveyor, now sweating profusely, confirmed his side. The HOA lady, Karen, she told us it was all cleared. She said it was community property and we had full access. Deputy Allen looked at me, then at the clearly marked stone property markers that ran along the edge of my land. She looked at the official "No trespassing" sign I had posted near the gate. "Sir," she said to the surveyor, "your client gave you bad information. This is clearly marked private land. If the owner asks you to leave, you leave. If you come back, he can have you charged. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Crystal clear," he mumbled, practically throwing the last of his equipment into the back of his truck. They drove off without a backward glance. Deputy Allen turned to me. "You might want to have a lawyer send the HOA a formal notice. This Karen sounds like she's going to be a problem." "That's the next step, Deputy," I said. "Thank you for stopping." "Just doing my job, sir. Have a good day." She got back in her cruiser and drove on. The entire exchange had been recorded by my camera. I now had video evidence of the HOA contracting a company to trespass on my land, and a law enforcement officer confirming their actions were illegal. I went back to the house and opened my laptop. I created a new folder in my evidence drive, Trespass Incident, Landmark Surveying. I uploaded the video file. Then I opened my master spreadsheet and added a new entry, detailing the date, time, individuals involved, and the intervention by the sheriff's department. Karen had tried to put boots on the ground. She had failed. But this was a significant escalation. She was no longer content to just send letters. She was willing to send people. This meant I had to accelerate my own timeline. The quiet war of paper was over. It was time to find the kill shot. It was time to go deeper into the archives. The incident with the surveyors lit a fire under me. Karen's willingness to send men onto my property, armed with a false sense of authority, proved she was operating without any regard for the law. She was a runaway train, and I needed to find a way to derail her before she did irreparable damage. My research, which had been a methodical evening activity, now became an obsession. I knew the answer had to lie in the past, in a document that predated the HOA, the development, and maybe even the modern county zoning laws. It had to be something fundamental. I expanded my search beyond the county clerk's digital archives and made an appointment to visit the county records office in person to access the physical, pre-digital files. The records office was in the basement of the old courthouse, a dimly lit space that smelled of aging paper and binding glue. It was a library of history filled with massive leather-bound ledgers and rows of dusty file boxes. I felt like I was in my element. I gave the clerk, a helpful woman named Martha, the parcel number for my land. She led me to a section of shelves and showed me how to use the index system. "It's all cross-referenced by year and owner name," she explained. "If it ever existed and was filed with the county, it's in here somewhere." For 3 days, I lost myself in that basement. I pulled down heavy books, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. I traced the chain of title for my land, not on a screen, but through the actual ink of past generations. I saw the signatures of the Millers, the family who had farmed the land for so long. I went past them to a family named Albright in the late 1800s. And that's where I found it. It wasn't a deed, not exactly. Tucked inside the folder for the 1888 property transfer from the state to one Jedediah Albright, my property's original homesteader, was a separate, smaller document. Read, Charter of Riparian Sovereignty, and read, Charter of Riparian Sovereignty and First Use. My heart started pounding. I had studied water rights as part of my engineering command coursework. First use was a powerful concept, especially in older water law. It often meant that the first person to use a water source for a beneficial purpose gained a senior right to it, a right that could supersede later claims. But riparian sovereignty? That was a term I'd never seen before. It sounded almost regal. I carefully read the text. The charter granted by the territorial governor before the state was even fully formed was a specific reward to Jedediah Albright for his service in a local militia. It didn't just grant him the land, it granted him something more. I read the key passage 3 times, my finger tracing the elegant, archaic script. And be it known that the spring which originates upon said parcel, and the full and total flow of the waters which issue forth from it, from its source to the point at which it leaves the boundary of said parcel, are hereby granted to said Jedediah Albright and to his heirs and assigns in perpetuity as a sovereign holding separate and distinct from the land itself, to be used for his benefit as he sees fit, unencumbered by future claims or levies from any lesser municipal or corporate body. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the silver bullet. It wasn't just a water right, it was a sovereign holding. It legally separated the ownership of the water from the ownership of the land. The territorial governor had granted my predecessor absolute monarchical control over every drop of water that came out of my spring. And that right was passed to his heirs and assigns in perpetuity. As the current owner, the assign, that sovereign right was now mine. This charter didn't just predate the Creekwood Estates HOA, it predated the town, the county's modern charter, and possibly even the state's own Water Resource Board. It was a foundational document, a piece of legal bedrock. Karen's flimsy theory about community waterways was a sandcastle about to be hit by a tidal wave. The term lesser municipal or corporate body was the kill shot. An HOA was the very definition of a lesser corporate body. This document explicitly and preemptively nullified any claim Karen could ever dream of making. I felt a wave of triumph wash over me, so potent it was almost dizzying. I had her. I had her dead to rights. I looked up at Martha, the clerk. "I need a certified copy of this document," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "The best quality you can possibly make." She must have seen the look on my face. "Found something good, huh?" "Martha," I said with a slow grin, "I think I just found the Declaration of Independence for my creek." I paid for 3 certified copies, each stamped with a gold seal from the county clerk, attesting to its authenticity as a true and accurate copy of the record held in the official archives. I walked out of that courthouse basement and into the bright sunlight, holding the envelope like it was a holy relic. Karen thought she was playing checkers, moving her little plastic pieces around the board. She had no idea I was about to drop a queen on the table, a piece with the power to sweep the entire board clean. The time for defense was over. The time for quiet evidence gathering was over. Now it was time to go on the offensive. It was time to find a lawyer and turn this beautiful, ancient piece of paper into a weapon she would never see coming. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like a soldier who had just been handed the enemy's encrypted battle plans. The 1888 Charter of Riparian Sovereignty was more powerful than I could have imagined, but I knew that wielding it correctly was just as important as possessing it. A powerful weapon in amateur hands can backfire. I needed a legal expert, someone who could appreciate the unique strength of this document and help me build an inescapable legal trap. I wasn't going to just send Karen a copy of the charter. That would be like showing my cards too early. She'd just pivot, lie, or try to challenge its authenticity in a drawn-out court battle. No, my strategy, refined during the drive home, was more ambitious. I would let her walk straight into the trap. I would let her break ground. I would let her spend the HOA's money, sign contracts, and physically commit to the crime of diverting my water. I would let her create a public spectacle of her own downfall. Then, and only then, would I deploy the charter, not just against her, but against every entity that enabled her. To do this, I needed the right lawyer. I didn't want some slick, expensive corporate attorney from a downtown firm. I needed a fighter, someone who understood the principles at stake. I remembered a flyer I'd seen at the local VFW hall for something called the Veterans Legal Advocacy Project. It was a small local firm run by younger veterans who provided low-cost or pro bono services to fellow vets. I found their number online and made an appointment. Their office was a modest suite above a coffee shop, a world away from the marble lobbies of big law. I was met by a man named Ben Carter. He was in his early 30s, sharp, energetic, with a crisp military haircut and a handshake that meant business. He'd been a JAG officer in the Marines. Perfect. "Mr. Davison," he said, gesturing me to a chair, "your call was intriguing. You said you had an HOA problem and a unique piece of evidence." I didn't say a word. I simply opened my briefcase and took out the file I had prepared for him. On top, inside a protective plastic sleeve, was one of the certified copies of the 1888 Charter. I laid it on the desk between us. Ben leaned forward, his eyes scanning the archaic script. He read it once, quickly. Then he read it again, slowly, his lips moving slightly. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper, looking at the certified stamp. Me 3 days. A charter of riparian me 3 days. A charter of riparian sovereignty, in perpetuity, unencumbered by lesser municipal or corporate bodies. He looked up at me, his eyes alight with a lawyer's predatory glee. "This is a nuke. This isn't a legal document. It's a legal kill shot. An HOA is the poster child for a lesser corporate body. This thing is ironclad." He stood up and started pacing his small office, buzzing with energy. "This predates everything. Any state water board regulations would likely have to grandfather this in. It's a foundational property right. It's beautiful." I then walked him through the rest of the story. I showed him my binders, my spreadsheets, the video of the surveyors, the threatening letters, the fraudulent invoices, the flyer for the town hall meeting. I laid out the entire campaign of harassment, documented in excruciating detail. He listened intently, his expression shifting from admiration for the charter to a cold anger as I detailed Karen's actions. She's running a textbook campaign of harassment and attempted conversion of private property, he said, sitting back down. She's so arrogant, she probably thinks the law is just whatever she can get a majority of homeowners to vote for. That's exactly what she thinks, I confirmed. So here's my plan, I said, leaning forward. I don't want to just stop her. I want to let her complete her own self-destruction. I want her to break ground. I want the HOA's money to be on the line. Then we drop the hammer. Ben's grin was wide and fierce. I love it. A classic rope-a-dope. Let her punch herself out. It's legally brilliant. By letting her start the work, she moves from conspiracy and harassment to actual, quantifiable damages. We can sue her and the HOA not just for trespassing, but for the cost of remediation, for the damage to the stream bed, for everything. And we can get an immediate injunction that will leave them with a half-dug, useless money pit. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out the strategy. Ben would draft the legal documents in advance. A formidable cease and desist letter citing the charter, a motion for an emergency injunction, and the framework for a civil lawsuit against the HOA, its board members personally, and the construction company they hired. We hit them all at once, Ben explained. The moment that first backhoe bucket breaks ground and touches that water, we deliver the packages. One to the HOA board, one to the CEO of the construction company, one to the county permit office, and the most important one, to the State Department of Environmental Quality. The DEQ? I asked. Oh yes, Ben said, rubbing his hands together. Karen might think she can fight me in civil court, but she can't fight the state. To divert that creek, she would have needed a state water diversion permit, which I guarantee she doesn't have because she thinks the water is hers. When we show the DEQ that she's illegally diverting a private sovereign water source without a permit and causing environmental disturbance, they won't send a letter. They will send armed environmental officers to shut the site down, and they will fine the HOA into oblivion. We're not just going to win, Mr. Davison. We're going to make an example out of them. I left Ben's office feeling 100 pounds lighter. I had found my weapon, and now I had found my gunner. All that was left to do was wait for the enemy to march into our kill zone. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day I watched the empty patch of land by the clubhouse, waiting for the first sign of activity. The HOA sent more fines, which I continued to log and ignore. The tension was building. It was the quiet moment before the battle, and I knew that when the noise started, it would be deafening. The waiting ended on a Tuesday morning in late September. The air had a crisp, autumnal edge to it, and the leaves on the oaks along my creek were just beginning to turn. I was on my porch with a cup of coffee when I heard it, the low rumble and metallic clatter of heavy machinery. My heart leaped into my throat. I grabbed my binoculars. Sure enough, 2 large flatbed trucks were pulling up to the clubhouse. One carried a bright yellow backhoe, the other a bulldozer. My surveillance camera overlooking the area was already recording. This was it. The trap was about to be sprung. I sent a one-word text to Ben. Go. Within minutes, a crew of men in hard hats were unloading the equipment. A white pickup truck pulled up, and out stepped a man with a set of rolled-up blueprints. He was met by Karen, who was wearing a brand-new, gleaming, white hard hat over her helmet of hair. She looked ecstatic, pointing and gesturing, a conquering general directing her troops. They were wasting no time. The backhoe operator fired up his machine, the diesel engine coughing to life with a cloud of black smoke that seemed to profane the clean morning air. He drove the machine across the common area, its heavy treads chewing up the manicured lawn, and positioned it right at the edge of the culvert where my creek flowed off my property and into the development. From my vantage point, I could see them preparing to build a dam and a diversion channel, exactly as the surveyors had planned. They were starting their work just inches outside my property line, a pathetic attempt at a legal loophole. They thought that by not being physically on my land, they were in the clear. They had no understanding of the charter. It didn't protect my land, it protected my water. The ownership was in the flow itself. Diverting it downstream was the same as taking it from the source. It was theft, plain and simple. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I forced myself to remain calm and follow the plan. I sat in a chair on my porch, my phone in my hand, and I watched. I was the silent witness to their crime. Sarah came out and stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tense. "I'm better than okay," I said, not taking my eyes off the scene. "I'm watching arrogance dig its own grave, literally." The backhoe's big articulated arms swung out over the creek bed. The metal bucket dipped down, and with a sickening scrape of metal on rock, it scooped up a load of earth and stone from the bank, beginning the process of widening the channel for their diversion pipe. That was the moment. The violation was no longer theoretical. It was happening. Ben called me. "The bucket broke ground, Jack. I saw it on the live feed you gave me access to. All messengers are dispatched. ETA, 15 minutes. The next 15 minutes were the longest of my life. I watched the backhoe take another scoop, then another. The clear water of my creek began to cloud with mud and silt. A line of brown discoloration was flowing downstream. They were already polluting it. I documented it all with my phone's camera, taking high-resolution pictures to supplement the video feed. Then I saw the first vehicle arrive. It wasn't a courier. It was a dark green pickup truck with the state seal on the door. Department of Environmental Quality. An officer in a tan uniform with a badge on his chest got out, a stern expression on his face. He walked directly toward the construction site. The foreman saw him coming and went to intercept him. I saw the DEQ officer flash his credentials. The foreman's body language changed instantly from confident to defensive. He started pointing toward Karen, who was puffing up, preparing to assert her authority. As the DEQ officer was confronting them, a second car pulled up, a plain black sedan. Ben Carter got out, dressed in a sharp suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He walked with the unhurried confidence of a man who knows he holds all the cards. A third vehicle, a simple courier van, arrived simultaneously, and a young man in a uniform hurried over to the construction foreman and handed him a thick legal envelope. Everything was happening at once, a perfectly coordinated strike. The DEQ officer was talking to Karen, who was waving her arms dismissively. Ben approached them, calm and cool. The foreman was ripping open the envelope from the courier. I could see his face fall as he read the first page. He shouted something to the backhoe operator. The roar of the engine died, and the arm of the machine, poised for another scoop, froze in midair. The sudden silence was stunning. All work had stopped. I watched through my binoculars as Ben handed Karen an identical legal envelope. She took it with a look of contempt, as if it were a piece of trash. She tore it open. I saw her eyes scan the first page. It would have been the cover letter, explaining that he represented me. Then she would have turned the page to the second document, the certified copy of the 1888 Charter of Riparian Sovereignty. I watched her face. The contemptuous smirk faltered. Her eyes widened. She reread the page, her mouth hanging slightly open. She looked from the paper in her hand to my house on the hill, then back to the paper. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a pasty, mottled white. The red blazer suddenly looked garish against her pale skin. She was finally truly understanding the colossal nature of her mistake. The DEQ officer said something, and the foreman frantically gestured for his crew to back away from the creek. Ben just stood there, a slight, satisfied smile on his face, as Karen's entire world crumbled around her, all documented on a single 130-year-old piece of paper. The war wasn't over, but the decisive battle had just been won, and the enemy was in complete and utter disarray. The scene at the construction site devolved into a beautiful, cinematic chaos. Karen stood frozen for a long moment, the charter trembling in her hand like a leaf in a storm. The DEQ officer, whose name I later learned was Reynolds, was not a man to be trifled with. He was pointing at the muddy plume flowing from the disturbed creek bank, his voice, even from my distant vantage point, carrying a tone of cold, bureaucratic fury. The construction foreman was on his phone, likely talking to his company's legal department, his face a mask of panic. He had just realized Karen's assurances were worthless, and his company was now implicated in a state-level environmental violation. Ben, my lawyer, let the scene marinate for a moment before he stepped forward and addressed Karen directly. I couldn't hear the words, but I could imagine the conversation. He would be calmly explaining the full legal ramifications of what she had just done. He would be informing her of the immediate stop work order from the DEQ, the impending civil lawsuit for damages and trespass, and the personal liability she and the other board members now faced for acting with such gross negligence. Karen finally snapped out of her shock, but it was replaced by a sputtering, incoherent rage. She started shouting, pointing a finger at Ben, then at the DEQ officer, then in the general direction of my house. But her power was gone. It had evaporated the moment the charter was revealed. She was no longer the president of the HOA leading a glorious community project. She was just a frantic woman in a hard hat who had led her followers off a legal cliff. Officer Reynolds from the DEQ was having none of it. He issued a verbal stop work order on the spot, informing the foreman that the site was now an active investigation scene. He began stringing up yellow, "Do not cross" tape, cordoning off the entire area, including the multi-million-dollar heavy machinery. The backhoe and bulldozer were now impounded as evidence, unable to be moved until the investigation was complete. The cost to the construction company would be astronomical, a fact not lost on the frantic foreman. Ben, having delivered his payload, gave a curt nod and walked back to his car. His job there was done. He had lit the fuse, and now the various state and county agencies would do the rest. He gave me a thumbs up as he drove away. The fallout was swift and brutal. The DEQ officially served the Creekwood Estates HOA with a notice of violation carrying an initial fine of $50,000 for unpermitted diversion of a waterway and another $25,000 for polluting a natural stream, with penalties of $10,000 per day until a full remediation plan was submitted and approved. The construction company, furious at being misled, immediately filed a lawsuit against the HOA for breach of contract and fraudulent misrepresentation, seeking to recover the cost of their mobilized equipment, their idle crew, and the damage to their professional reputation. The county permit office, having received their own package from Ben, including a copy of the charter, issued a notice of revocation for the pool's building permit. The permit application, they stated, was based on a fraudulent water source claim, rendering the entire approval null and void. The news spread through Creekwood Estates like a wildfire. The glorious, cost-saving pool project had, in the span of a single morning, become a catastrophic financial liability that threatened to bankrupt the entire association. The half-dug trench in the muddy Wounded Creek bank, cordoned off with yellow tape, became a monument to Karen's hubris. The best part was the legal trap we had set. Because Karen had started the work, we could now sue for tangible damages. Ben filed our civil suit the next day. We sued the HOA for trespass, conversion of private property, and property damage. But we also named Karen and her two board members personally in the suit, arguing that their actions were so far outside the scope of reasonable governance that they had pierced the corporate veil that normally protects board members. We were coming after their personal assets for the damages they had caused. This was the move that broke the back of her remaining support. It was one thing to cheer for a community pool. It was another to risk your own home to pay for your president's folly. The timid man from the board resigned immediately, claiming he had been misled by Karen. The poodle-walking woman tried to fight it for a day, but when her husband, a local accountant, saw the lawsuit, she too tendered her resignation. Karen was left completely isolated, a captain on a sinking ship of her own design. The community she had so proudly claimed to lead had turned on her with a vengeance. The whispers that had followed me now followed her. The glares I had endured were now directed at her every time she left her house. She had promised them a lazy river, and instead she had delivered a river of debt and legal trouble. The reversal was total, public, and deeply, deeply satisfying. The final act of this drama played out, fittingly, in the same soulless clubhouse where Karen had held her victory rally. The HOA was legally required to hold an emergency meeting to address the tsunami of legal and financial disasters that had befallen them. This time the atmosphere was not one of excited anticipation, but of cold, simmering fury. Sarah and I attended, but instead of sitting in the back, we took seats right in the front row. I brought my binders, all of them. I stacked them on the floor in front of me, a silent, multi-volume testament to the battle that had been fought and won. Karen sat at the head table, but her lieutenants were gone, replaced by empty chairs. She looked haggard. Her trademark blonde helmet seemed deflated, and the power red blazer had been replaced by a drab gray cardigan. She looked smaller, diminished. The room was packed, even more so than before. People were standing along the walls. The man who had been her planted questioner at the last meeting now glared at her with open hostility. The meeting began with a grim financial report from the HOA's treasurer, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He laid out the catastrophic numbers, the DEQ fines, the daily penalties, the legal fees to defend against the construction company's lawsuit, and the estimated cost of our own impending civil suit. He explained that the HOA's reserve funds were already wiped out. To cover the costs, a special assessment would be required. The number he announced was staggering, an immediate one-time payment of $10,000 per household. A gasp went through the room, followed by an uproar of angry shouts. People were screaming about their mortgages, their retirement funds. Karen tried to bang a gavel for order, but the sound was lost in the noise. It was then that Dave, the man who had questioned Karen at the first meeting, stood up. The room gradually fell silent, waiting to hear what he had to say. "I think," Dave said, his voice ringing with clarity and anger, "that before we talk about paying a single dollar, we need to hear from Mr. Davison. I think we owe him an apology, and I think we need to understand exactly how our president led us into this mess." Every head turned to me. I stood up, walked to the front, and placed a single document on the projector for all to see: the 1888 Charter of Riparian Sovereignty. "This," I began, my voice steady and strong, "is a certified copy of a document from the county archives. It grants me, as the current owner of my land, sovereign and perpetual ownership of the water that flows from the spring on my property. It explicitly states that my ownership is unencumbered by any lesser municipal or corporate body. That means an HOA. I then walked them through the entire story, using my binders as props. I put up copies of the first letters Karen had sent. I showed them my polite, legal responses, which she had ignored. I put up the fraudulent invoice for $3,500. I described the town hall where she had lied to them about the legality of her plan. I played a short clip from my security camera, showing the surveyors trespassing on my land and the sheriff's deputy instructing them to leave. The room was dead silent, captivated. The homeowners were seeing, for the first time, the mountain of evidence that proved Karen's campaign was not a good faith effort for the community, but a malicious, illegal, and personal vendetta. "Your president was informed in writing from the very beginning that her plan was illegal," I said, my voice rising. "She was told she was trespassing. She ignored the facts. She ignored the law. She lied to all of you about her solid legal ground. She gambled with your money and she lost. And she expects you to pay for her mistake." I turned and looked directly at Karen. This was never about a pool. This was about power. And when her quest for power ran into a simple property line, she tried to erase it. But you can't erase history. You can't erase the law. I finished and walked back to my seat. The silence held for a moment, and then the dam of public anger broke. A woman stood up and screamed, "Resign! Resign now!" The chant was picked up by others, growing into a deafening roar. "Resign! Resign! Resign!" Karen sat there, her face ashen, as the community she had tried to manipulate and control turned on her completely. A motion was made from the floor to remove her as president and as a board member, effective immediately. The vote was nearly unanimous. She was stripped of her title and her power in a public ritual of humiliation. She stumbled out of the clubhouse to a chorus of boos, a fallen tyrant. The aftermath was messy but cathartic. With Karen gone, a new, more reasonable board was elected, led by Dave. Their first act was to come to me, hat in hand. Ben and I met with them. We didn't want to bankrupt our neighbors. That was never the point. The point was justice. We agreed to a settlement. The HOA would pay for a full, DEQ-approved restoration of the creek bank. They would issue a formal public apology to me and Sarah in the community newsletter. And they would pay our legal fees. In return, we would drop the civil suit against the association and the personal suits against the now powerless board members. Karen, however, was not so lucky. The construction company's lawsuit against the HOA was settled when the HOA's insurance carrier agreed to pay them. But the insurance company then turned around and sued Karen personally to recoup their losses, arguing her actions constituted willful misconduct not covered by the board's liability policy. She was forced to sell her oversized house to pay the legal fees and the settlement. The last I saw of her, she was loading boxes into a moving van, her reign over Creekwood Estates over for good. The half-dug hole for the pool sat there for months, a concrete scar on the landscape, a constant reminder of the cost of arrogance. Eventually, the HOA paid to have it filled in and resodded. There would be no lazy river. There would only be the quiet, peaceful flow of my creek, now more respected than ever. I often sit on the small footbridge I built, the one that started it all. Dave, my neighbor, sometimes joins me. We've become good friends. We talk about our time in the service, our families, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The water flows clear and pure beneath our feet, just as it has for centuries. It's a reminder that some things, like integrity, justice, and the simple rights of a man on his own land, are worth fighting for. The war was over, peace had been restored, and the creek, my creek, flowed freely.